to meet you. It is a truly wonderful honor and pleasure to deliver this keynote entitled Canaries in the Coal Mine, Flying Foxes and Extreme Heat Events in a Warming Climate. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the country I'm recording on, the Darug people, and pay my respects to them, their culture, and to the elders past, present and emerging. As many of you will have noticed in the media this week, the IPCC has just released its sixth assessment report. I had a look, and not unexpectedly, it makes for some pretty grim reading. In fact, it is difficult not to become overtaken by climate grief. Global temperatures have increased precipitously since the Industrial Revolution, and it's now clear that the last decade was hotter than any period in the last 125 years. Observed warming can clearly be attributed to emissions from human activities. What some of you may not realize is that temperature records are now broken on a monthly basis. At my university, I've been teaching a unit called Biological Adaptations to Climate Change for many years, and every year, without fail, I've been able to maintain this slide by simply updating the boldface text according to the most recent data available. What does it say? Well, the global land-only surface temperature for June 2021 was the highest on record at 1.42 degrees Celsius above average. It also marked the 45th consecutive June that was warmer than the global 20th century average. And it marked the 438th consecutive month that was warmer than average. Indeed, the last month that was cooler than normal was February 1985. Here. Which means that if you're younger than 36.5 years old, you have never experienced a colder than average month in your life. So February 1985 is a month that was burnt into my young memory because it was the year when Evert van Bentum won the Elfstedentocht, which for someone growing up in the Netherlands was an extremely exciting national event. We've had only two other Elfstedentochten since then, one in 1986 and one in 1997, which involved lots of skaters having to skip weak sections of the ice by what we call klooning on their skates overland to avoid cracking through the ice. We have not had an Elfstedentocht since, as conditions have simply been too warm to allow for the event to be held again. It is clear that anthropogenic climate change is already impacting our physical world. So according to the latest IPCC report, Arctic sea ice has reached its lowest annual average level since at least 1850. Sea levels have risen faster since 1900 than over any preceding century in at least the last 3,000 years. Precipitation events have increased in frequency and intensity since the 1950s over most land areas, and tropical cyclones have become more intense over the last 4 decades. Hot extremes have become more intense and frequent across most land regions since the 1950s. And there is more warming to come. That is, unless greenhouse gas mitigation is urgently implemented, global temperatures are likely to continue to escalate into the future, compounding impacts that are already being observed. In our global analysis, where we modeled the future climatic range change of nearly 50,000 common and widespread species, we came to the sobering conclusion that the reality of human-forced rapid climate change presents an unprecedented challenge to the conservation of biodiversity. Without greenhouse gas emission, climate change will greatly reduce the diversity of even common and widespread species in most parts of the world. The loss of global-scale biodiversity would significantly impoverish the biosphere and the ecosystem services it provides. It is well known that climate change is also a major threat to bats and presents great challenges to bat conservation, as highlighted, for example, by these two seminal reviews I show here. So it can negatively affect survival, reproduction and development, and influences access to food and migratory behavior and distributions. But, importantly for this talk, extreme weather events such as cyclones and extreme heat can cause rapid population declines and so further decrease the resilience of already threatened populations, particularly on islands. Climate change dramatically alters the regimes of extreme heat events through shifts in the mean and the shape of temperature distribution. This is illustrated by this animation of real summer temperature data from the Northern Hemisphere. And note the disproportionate increase in hot temperatures, there to its right, due to the combination of shifts in the mean and the shape of temperature distribution. According to the latest IPCC report, such anthropogenic changes in extreme heat events are already readily observable throughout the world, including in Australia and the Pacific, as highlighted by that red circle there in the bottom right. Worryingly, extreme heat events are expected to increase in frequency and intensity. What were once 50-year events now occur about once every decade and risk occurring nearly once a year by the end of this century. 50-year events are now 1.2 degrees hotter than previously and risk becoming 5.3 degrees hotter at the end of this century. Clearly, it's very important to understand what the impacts are of extreme heat events on biodiversity. However, due to its stochastic and irregular nature, these events are not very well documented. But one relatively well-documented example of impacts of extreme heat events on biodiversity involves flying foxes. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So earlier this century, from 2001 to 2005, I studied the roosting ecology of the grey-headed flying fox as part of my PhD on the social organization of this species. In a nutshell, my main questions could be summarized as who hangs with whom, where, when, and why. It was while studying this that I was in the unfortunate position to document the impacts of an extreme heat event on terrestrial biodiversity directly. My primary study site was a large flying fox colony located near Welbergen in northern New South Wales. This roost contained two similar species of flying fox, namely the grey-headed flying fox and the black flying fox. Both species are amongst the largest flying fox in the world, with similar sort of slow lane life history strategies and food preferences. But note that the grey-headed flying fox is the more temperate flying fox species. In fact, it's the most temperate flying fox species in the world, most subtly occurring. Whereas the black flying fox has a more tropical distribution. So during the summer of my second year of my PhD, a mass of extremely hot air was moving across the continent of Australia. And the focal point of this extreme happened to coincide exactly with the location of my main study site. And the results were quite devastating. During this event and during subsequent events, we learned that in response to rising temperatures, flying foxes exhibit a predictable sequence of thermoregulatory behaviors. I'll talk through these in turn. First, as temperatures are rising, they begin with fanning their wings. And this graph here on the right shows the proportion of individuals engaging in this behavior in relation to ambient temperature. So why do they fan their wings? Well, wing fanning is a commonly observed behavior among flying foxes and is thought to facilitate thermoregulation by forced convection of air. And this can be an effective way for dissipating heat as long as ambient temperatures do not exceed body temperature. Next, animals started moving to the shade of tree stems and into leaf-covered branch areas where they form dense clusters. So why do they cluster? As this behavior seems very similar to huddling, which is used by other species of bats to stay warm, this is quite counterintuitive. Thermal imaging has given us a compelling answer here. So in this video, the tree is the coolest object available within the flying fox's microhabitat, up to 13 degrees cooler than the surrounding air. And you can see congregating individuals here and know that they are seeking out these objects to enhance conductive heat loss. So flying foxes are not unique in this, as similar behavior has also been described, for example, in koalas by Briscoe et al. Next, flying foxes begin licking their wings and their forearms. Why? Well, when ambient temperature exceeds body temperature, wing fanning is no longer effective for heat dissipation. And since flying foxes do not have active sweat glands, alternative mechanisms to evaporative cooling are needed to keep their body temperature below lethal limits. Here you can see the effect that salivation has on heat dissipation. And the areas in purple on the flying foxes are those that are wet from salivation. So here the loss of body fluids will be significant, and which is consistent with them no longer engaging in this behavior during the later stages of heat events. Rapid panting is the final stage, and this represents the final stage within the behavioral sequence. And at this stage, the bats are in a bad way. At the same time, especially when ambient temperatures approach 42 degrees, individuals start coming down from their branches and can be found at the base of trees and sometimes even under tree roots or in wombat holes. Individuals are then mostly still alive but can be easily approached. If you don't like to see dead animals, then I ask you to look away for a moment. So when the events are very extreme, many individuals then do not come up from the ground and instead litter the forest floor with their corpses. And during my PhD, the effects of the temperature extreme on my study colony were quite dramatic, with 1,500 bats, or about 10% of the entire colony, dying in a single hot afternoon alone. So at the time, I tried to make the most of that dreadful situation, and my student, Stefan Kloos, and I decided to have a closer look at those individuals that died. So, because I was studying the social organization of flying foxes at that location, I knew exactly who was present at the site prior to the event. And this is roughly the composition of the colony by species. So the majority was composed of grey-headed flying fox. But when we compared the animals that were present versus those that died, it turned out that mortality was heavily biased towards the black flying fox. So this was clearly a counterintuitive result, because black flying foxes are the more tropical species. However, while average temperatures are higher in tropical Australia, maximum temperatures are much higher at mid-latitudes. And as a more tropical species, the black flying fox has evolved in the context of lower maximum temperatures. So in other words, the more temperate grey-headed flying fox has a pre-adaptive advantage over the tropical black flying fox in coping with temperature extremes. This has implications for tropical species, and it's not just limited to flying foxes. There's actually quite a lot of evidence now that across the board, animals that live closer to the tropics have much narrower thermal tolerance limits, and therefore are much less able to tolerate even small changes in temperature. There's an interesting side story here, in that the black flying fox has been expanding its range southwards since 1932. From Rockhampton, on the left, to Melbourne, right down at the bottom. And the black flying fox now effectively occupies the entire grey-headed flying fox range. The range expansion significantly increases their exposure to extreme heat events by virtue of the relationship between extreme temperatures and latitude, as well as the temporal increase in temperature extremes that I showed you earlier. So while the jury on why the species is expanding is still out, it provides a window into climate change future, as by moving southwards, they're experiencing the predicted increase in extreme heat events in an accelerated manner. So yes, so this provides a window into our climate change future. We also found that mortality was biased towards juveniles and mature females. And the higher mortality in juveniles is in keeping with the lower thermoregulatory capacity of younger individuals. And where assessed, mature females that died were lactating, and lactating is known to increase thermoregulatory needs in mammals. So, following the event, we learned that at least 4,000 animals died that day in 9 different roosts in the region. And at the time, this caused a lot of surprise, if not disbelief and concern. Was this a one-off event? Or is this a structural problem for flying foxes? Well, since 2002, we have been recording these events systematically and consider the impacts of some of the most major events here. For example, in 2014, there was a large event in southeast Queensland. Here, 52 colonies were affected and 45,500 animals died, flying foxes died. As before, mortality was biased towards black flying foxes, juveniles and adult females. But here's the kicker. 50% of all black flying foxes that were known to occur in this 500-kilometer stretch of southeastern Queensland coastline died in that single hot afternoon. So after this event, there was another large event in New South Wales this time. Here, 15 colonies were affected and more than 10,000 animals died. Again, mortality was biased towards black flying foxes, juveniles and adult females. And then there was the much publicized event in November in far north Queensland, where extreme temperatures slowly moved over the region over a period of about 3 days. Here, 10 colonies were affected. It's likely an underestimate because we were not able to map everything, especially that we know very little about the southern colonies here. But we do know that at least 43,000 animals died. Here, mortality involved both the black flying fox and the spectacled flying fox. Of those, 23,000 animals were spectacled flying fox. And that represents 30% of all Australian spectacled flying foxes. So 30% of an entire species present in Australia died in this single event. And then there was what is now known as Black Summer, when more than 72,000 animals, flying foxes, died across at least 8 separate extreme heat events, involving many different colonies. Just considering the major events where casualties exceeded 1,000 individuals shows you the almost biblical impacts that extreme events are having on Australia's flying foxes. This amounts to an estimate of more than 233,000 casualties, with more than 200,000 deaths recorded in the last decade alone. And note that these are severe underestimates of true impacts, because not all events are recorded due to logistical constraints, and because we still don't know where all the camps are. These events are not limited to Australia, but there is a lack of central recording, and so it's difficult to ascertain the true scale of the impacts on flying foxes globally. So are die-offs more common now than they are in the past? The data would certainly suggest so, as the vast majority of recorded events comes from the recent past. But there's a clear risk of recency bias here, and to circumvent that, we can look at temperature instead. So we know that mortality is strongly associated with temperatures greater than 42 degrees. So for flying foxes, 42 degrees is life, the universe, and everything in this respect. So we learned this from the 2002 event, but also from extensive temperature recordings in roosts subsequently. So, and when we examine the annual frequency of plus 42 degree temperatures at roost locations in Eastern Australia, the probability that flying foxes will experience heat stress has increased by about threefold since the 1970s. So, will die-offs become more common in the future? Well, there's little doubt that Australian summers will become hotter, and so die-offs will become more frequent and more widespread. So our current work focuses on understanding the vulnerability of flying foxes to extreme heat events and provide a much needed evidence base for management and conservation. So flying fox die-offs are an important conservation management issue. They reverberate throughout Australia's forest ecosystems as flying foxes perform key ecological roles as pollinators and seed dispersers. Die-offs can also be a substantial burden for local communities and place enormous demands on local land managers, health officials, and wildlife carers especially. So there is an urgent need for effective coordinated management responses. Effective management of flying fox heat stress events relies on accurate prediction, evidence-based intervention methods, and comprehensive documentation. So at present there are elements of this in Australian flying fox heat stress management, but it is by no means perfect. And my lab, with many other stakeholders, has been working hard to improve this. So to help predict these events, we have developed what we call a flying fox heat stress forecaster. This online forecaster predicts up to 72 hours into the future where known flying fox roosts are likely to be exposed to extreme heat. The forecaster has high accuracy as tested against past mortality data. Outputs include maps of affected areas, lists of priority colonies ranked by date, temperature and size, and temperature profiles for priority colonies. And these outputs help direct wildlife rehabilitators, land managers and health officials towards where and when flying fox die-offs are likely to occur. At present, intervention mostly focuses on cooling individuals or roosts using the application of water. While spraying of individuals by hand can cool highly distressed individuals, as we know from thermal observations. But it can disturb other bats. Wholesale misting or spraying decreases temperature but raises humidity and therefore decreases the vapor pressure deficits. And this risks a net increase in heat stress for the bats. And this too can disturb already heat stressed bats. So the effectiveness for reducing heat stress is not scientifically proven at present. And there is a lot of research activity at the moment trying to determine whether and under what conditions these interventions benefit the bats. There's also a risk that such interventions may lead to increased mortality when animals are forced to leave their cooler microhabitats. And this is a major concern that is an integral part of existing flying fox heat stress response guidelines. Documentation of impacts and the types of management interventions that were deployed is essential, and to facilitate this we have developed a flying fox heat stress data portal. This data portal helps collate data which contributes to more effective management. It also highlights the enormous public service that wildlife rescuers provide during these events. And it helps create a much better understanding of the impacts on flying foxes of these events. However, these data are very difficult to obtain. including because those who are on site during these events are overwhelmed, overworked, and often underpaid. So we have recently made great progress in our lab developing new techniques for monitoring flying fox population using remote sensing techniques. And these promise to make documentation much less challenging, I should say. For example, we have demonstrated that weather radar data can be used to monitor the numbers, timing, and directions of flying foxes emerging from their roosts. So here the animation on the right shows you the flying foxes emerging from the Yarra Bend camp in Melbourne, as detectable in weather radar data. The graph below shows a strong correspondence of the counts derived from the weather radar data, that's the grey squiggly line, and flyout and static counts, sort of traditional flying fox camp monitoring methods. Importantly, this can be done retrospectively from archival radar data, but in principle this can also be done in real time. And weather radar data, we know, reveals clear signals of extreme heat events in flying fox emergences. For example, it shows evidence of disrupted emergence activity during extreme heat events. And it also shows incomplete recovery of the local population following severe heat events. So this can potentially be used to assess remotely and retrospectively the severity of impacts of extreme heat events on flying fox colonies. And this is something that we're currently working on. In addition, we have shown that thermal imagery from drones can be used to count flying foxes at roost semi-automatically, and as you can see here, with high accuracy and precision. And recently, Eliana McCarthy and Annabel Dorstein have demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach on tropical and remote Christmas Island. So it works on the tropical conditions as well. So this potentially provides a reliable means for assessing impacts of extreme heat events on flying fox colonies directly by flying a drone over a camp before and after extreme heat events, or shortly before and shortly after extreme heat events. So what are the implications for biodiversity more broadly? Well, flying fox die-offs are conspicuous events that are relatively easily documented. So this raises concern that similar impacts occur in species with more solitary and cryptic lifestyle, where impacts are more difficult to observe and quantify. Well, indeed, heat-related die-offs have been reported in other fauna, including koalas, Carnaby's black cockatoos, budgerigars, bumblebees, butterflies, and humans, just to name a few. And why should we worry about extreme heat events? Well, they're among the principal ways in which animals strongly experience climate change. They can affect biodiversity at all levels, from individual behavior to ecosystem function, and they already have important socioeconomic impacts, particularly in sectors with close links to climate, for example, agriculture, forestry, tourism, and health. And given the latest IPCC report, it is clear that they will only continue to gain significance as drivers of natural responses to climate change. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you profoundly to all those who have contributed to this work.